Tickets for this year's SCI-Arc Alumni Association main event, which is a fundraiser for SCI-Arc scholarships, will be on sale after the lecture in the hallway behind the lecture room. This year, the main event is called 3030 Vision, and it's a tribute to SCI-Arc's 30 years. The event, which will include a silent and live auction of napkins from prominent artists and architects, as well as furniture and other items, will be on auction. We have over 100 auction items this year. It will be held this Saturday at the Pacific Design Center, so I invite you all to come. It's going to be a great event, and please buy tickets today. Thank you.
There's an old Spanish proverb which reads as follows: "Tell me to what you pay attention, and I'll tell you who you are. Tell me to what you pay attention, and I'll tell you who you are." The proverb presumes that each human life demands choices, and that an evaluation of choices made reveals the intrinsic meaning of that life. This premise obviously requires that some options and opportunities will be ruled out, others in. So now we come to the human anomaly known as Michael Sorkin, whose personal and professional bibliography seems directed at emasculating the proverb's premise. Because what is most intriguing about Michael's career is that he seems to have ruled everything in. This is, of course, not literally true, but perhaps it is asymptotic to the truth. Michael continues to teach and to lecture from nearly every available podium on the planet. He speaks about cities and buildings. He advocates. He pillories. Michael continues to write, to editorialize, and to edit books, magazines, newspapers, print, and electronic, issues, social, political, economic. Michael is less polemicist, more polemicists, and we're not done yet. Michael makes exhibits and installations. He continues to propose city plans and building projects. And he is heard and listened to, though, to be fair, not everyone is a subscriber. Now I understand Michael has become an administrator, the director of an urban planning program in New York. So how can we tell Michael who he is? There have been frequent discussions of the division of knowledge into discrete categories, of the compartmentalization of ideas, and the rise of specialists who talk only to other specialists as they congratulate each other on the wisdom they alone share. That conception of knowledge is the antithesis of Sorkin's, Michael breaks down conventional intellectual and professional categories. He reconciles and reassociates disparate areas of knowledge. He returns us to a humane, literate, and integrated conception of human affairs, far from the prevailing segregated model. And for this, he has been criticized for dividing himself too thinly. Michael Sorkin's ecumenical ambitions are unique in the contemporary architecture discourse. But not everyone has the versatility or the stomach for a multiple choice career. So in the most supportive and empathetic sense, I want to recite for Michael a refrain I recall from a sign over the entrance to a cemetery in Genoa. Congratulations and condolences. Welcome to SCI-Arc, Michael.
Who are you calling a human anomaly? It's a pleasure to be back in SCI-Arc. I dare say this is the best SCI-Arc yet. This is my first time in the building, and it's wonderful. It is intimidating to follow an introduction so much more eloquent and learned than anything I have to say. But let me make the attempt, thank you. I'm going to attempt to limit this lecture to 2 Coca-Colas. I was told a medium range would be good. I'm sorry, I'm a little delirious with jet lag. It's 11 o'clock where I come from. So I'm just going to launch into this lecture. And it is an architect's lecture. I want to talk about work that we've been doing in the office over the last 10 or 12 years, most of which is focused on urban issues. That's my passion and concern. Speaking of that administrative gig, I do run a fabulous urban design program at City University in New York. Those of you who wish to pursue further educational endeavors at low cost are invited to apply. The biggest bargain in American higher education, two semesters, 7 bills, master's degree. Can't beat that. So I want to talk to you about urbanization through the medium of work that we have been doing. We specialize in our office in what we refer to as unsolicited master planning. Never being ones to wait for a commission, given the fact that the world has to be reconfigured, we simply launch in. One of the issues that all urbanists confront, and is part of your daily theoretical diet, I'm sure, is the exponential urbanization of the planet and the various foul forms of globalization that are so much with us late and soon. Globalization, a pathetic platitude, is something that we know destabilizes the idea of location. And location is the fundamental, the bedrock of any winning urbanism. So the question that we have to ask as architects and urbanists in response to this regime of universal sameness is how to resist. What kind of strategies can we as architects and designers and urbanists and citizens invent to celebrate difference on the planet, to recuperate the numerousness of urban design solutions, and to create fresh differences in the urban landscape? I think there are 3 main axes that we might look at by way of resisting the dumb universalization of global architecture. The first of these axes of resistance is culture and tradition. I won't say very much about that because it fuels so much of our worst nightmare of what the city could be. Ideas about culture completely extracted from any originating context or any situation that gives them real meaning have become stock in trade of the predominant discourse of the urban nowadays, the so-called new urbanism, which seeks to follow up on the most traditional form of architectural hubris, which is the assumption that somehow identifying culture with its architecture enables us to remove that architecture from its point of origin, reinscribe it in some fresh location, and create the same set of cultural values that created it originally, a nonsensical process. The second, I think, more productive, more interesting axis for resisting the homogenizing effects of global culture is a consideration of the bioclimatic character of architecture. And this is very important in our work, and I imagine very important in yours. Every place defines a singular relationship between the human body and the landscape in which it exists. And I mean this in the most basic biological way. The range of climates and materialities and organisms that we find in a place are fundamental to its genius loci and somehow have to be imported, of course, in a subtle, nuanced, planetary, and sustainable way into our architecture. I won't speak about this very much tonight, but I will speak about the third axis of resistance, and I know I speak to a sympathetic audience, and that is, it's so dark at SCI-Arc, it's astonishing. Many things well done in this building, lighting not one of them. And that artistic differences. Yeah? If we are seeking for a way of making cities and architectures different, I think that we are in a period where we must value artistic difference above all. This may seem itself particularly narcissistic and arrogant, the idea that the imposition of artistic differences on cities as a means of creating what I am calling original and sustainable differences, this may sound a little misguided to you. I would argue, in rebuttal, that I think this notion of inscribing artistic difference is using artistic difference to create the kinds of differences that have historically come from long digesting cultural processes, is redeemed by the fact that the problem is tremendous. You know, the population of the world is literally increasing exponentially. We're now 6 billion and change. Half of us live in cities. We urbanize at the rate of 1 million people a week. And the answer to this is not unsustainable megacities and sprawl without end, amen. It is the project of creating new cities. And these new cities, at least in their kind of formative years, have to seek differences in acts of the invention of those who create them. So I want to show you some provocations in this realm that we have done. And this lecture falls into two halves. The first half deals with some utopias, places that are essentially placeless. And the second half of the lecture deals with some utopias. These, however, are in New York City, which for me is the ultimate utopia, the mother lode, the Rosetta Stone, the city that decodes all cities, my great love and the inspiration for many of our architectural dreams. So without further ado, I gave a lecture in Iran 2 weeks ago. And one of the things that the bad relations between the axis of evil and the great Satan has produced is an incredible absence of Coca-Cola. Otherwise, a stimulating and friendly environment. And I did see Bahram Chagall, by the way. Everybody remember Bahram, who apparently was suspected initially of being an agent of the CIA, but now has commissions up the wazoo, so go figure. I bring up Iran because it borders on Iraq. And I'm sorry to say that given the grisly outcome of the election yesterday, the likelihood that we will be engaged with that hapless country in the near future seems to have grown considerably. This is a project that was done the last time a Bush meddled with the Iraqis. Some of you may be old enough to remember the invasion of Kuwait and Iraq and the Desert Storm operation from 1991, which inspired the project I'm about to show you, the first city from scratch we did in our studio. And the specific inspiration for this was the victory parade that took place at the end of our liberation of Kuwait. And for some reason, it was on Broadway in New York City, not too far from my studio. So we all turned out to watch this parade, which was on a beautiful day in the autumn. And we saw, you know, rank upon rank of the most attractive, well-attired, buff-looking young people marching up Broadway. You know, a rainbow of American diversity, beautiful. Handsome camouflage uniforms, wonderful equipment, and so on and so forth. Marching up Broadway to the cheers of the crowds until they reached Canal Street, at which point they dispersed, presumably heading for the various flesh pots of Soho and Tribeca to do what young people will do after a parade. And I remember thinking to myself on seeing this dissipation of the parade, wouldn't it be great if instead of heading for the bars in the village, they would keep on marching, you know, on up Broadway until they got to Harlem, the South Bronx, various places in the city where those resources could be put to some good use. You know, where these kids could educate people and build houses and hospitals and schools and clean the toxics out of the environment and so on and so forth. And, you know, this reverie, you know, these were the days when we thought we were going to get the so-called peace dividend, and we were going to eliminate our military in favor of more peaceable, more benign activities. And I began to think in terms of, you know, what are these people going to do, you know, if we can have this peace dividend. In those days, the discourse was very narrow, you know, this conversion discourse. And in general, what was being spoken about was, oh, we'll take the B-52 plant and we'll make refrigerators there. But this kind of microscopic conversion, industrial conversion, didn't seem to come to terms with the real magnitude of the resource, not just the money and the technology, but the culture that had been built up over 200 years, the way of getting things done, the grandeur, the associations, the ins and the outs. And I thought, what activity has the grandeur of warfare, but could be a kind of appropriate sunset move for the armed forces, a gift back to the nation as they depart from the scene? And one thing came to mind, and that was the building of cities. We need plenty of them. They've got the territory, they've got the cash, they've got the machinery. Let them build cities, live there in retirement. So we cast about for a suitable military base on which to design our first city, and we found the Yuma Proving Ground along the Colorado River somewhere in Arizona, and we decided we would design a city there. This is a particularly apt site because it's the desert warfare testing station, and all those tanks and guns and vehicles that had been used in Arizona. So we designed the city of Weed, Arizona. And I show you a piece of the site plan. Weed, Arizona, I show you because it defines a lot of what are for us the fundamental motherhood issues of urban design and culture. And I will show you this zipatone figure here, which is a neighborhood. Neighborhoods are the fundamental social constituents of urbanity, and by my lights, they should be traversable on foot. So these neighborhoods are 20 minutes walk across. You can see a bunch of them. They have no cars, and they are densely laced with circulatory possibilities in order to induce the kind of accidental sociability that is the substrate of humane and democratic urbanism. The sluiceway has become a transit way. As I say, the cars are off there. This is a city with an edge. Again, I'm a strong believer in growth limits and boundaries as urban generators. So we began to draw Weed, Arizona. And here is one of the drawings that we made. It looks a little convulsed. But I think there's a lot of information in this drawing, although I can't exactly specify to you what it is. But one thing that I can insist on is that any difference that's represented in this drawing is meant to signify a difference. So you can see that there is a pattern of green and different shades of blue. What might that mean? I'm not sure. I mean, it could mean gardens, bioremediation zones, recreation, ornamental horticulture, farming. I'm not sure, but it does represent a certain rejiggering of the familiar ratios of green, blue, and built space in the city. And it is meant to suggest a variety and an intensity of use. What can we say about the architecture? Well, there it is. For starters, there are a lot of ways of circulating in it, but also I think it's an architecture about which one can make a series of fairly fundamental conclusions. I mean, if one enters the exercise thinking that this is a city which is contoured to the body and the climate, a certain set of assumptions immediately arises. If we want solar access and cross-ventilation, that means the dimensions of the buildings are going to be within a certain set of limits. So suddenly we know how big things are. If we want two ways of getting every place, suddenly a certain burden is imposed on the circulatory system. And if we really want to privilege human locomotion, both in the horizontal and the vertical plane, another set of assumptions can be added. Now, I live in New York City, in an old law tenement building on the top floor, the 5th floor. And I can tell you, without reservation, that after over 20 years of exacting empirical research, the 5th floor is the absolute limit of the ability of middle-aged Americans to climb stairs. Therefore, if our city is based on human locomotion, it probably isn't going to be much taller than 5 stories as a general matter. It's also a city that is structured as a loft. One of the boons of globalization and the technologies it brings with us, as well as one of the curses, the old Janus, is the fact that location is getting very free nowadays. With all these technologies of instantaneous artificial adjacency, you can do anything anywhere. Your hotel room out in the barn or in the loft. And as we get over the kind of regime of zoning as the armature for making cities, which is to say the idea that certain uses are intrinsically obnoxious, or certain people are intrinsically obnoxious and have to be separated from other uses and other people in the structure of the city. Once we get over that, this idea that anything can be anywhere in the city is liberated, which again suggests that the city is structured fundamentally like a loft, a series of spaces which are a little bit resistant, that somehow get assembled and configured for almost any use. Now, of course, having said that, it is nevertheless true that one of the special qualities of quarters and places in cities is that they are functionally unique and that they serve elements that need particularly purposive kinds of buildings. So here's a place with theaters and a piazza, and Broadway going across it. So, kind of, what would we call this? An entertainment area. And that is a kind of specialization which will happen via a kind of natural process, even in the city of lofts. Here's a view of a big model we made after a major seismic event occurred in Weed, Arizona. Here is one of those neighborhoods. This is a small one. But you can see there's a stairwell. You can see the size of these buildings and get a pretty good idea of the scale and the probability that breezes would blow through them. Here's that same neighborhood in model form with some kind of canopy to protect people from the cruelties of the afternoon sun in Arizona. As I said, it's important that cities, in order to engender encounter, have many kinds of centers, different dimensions, different activities, different registers, different characteristics. And here is one fairly convulsed center with some loft buildings circling in a counterclockwise direction around this central place, and you can see this madness of circulation going everywhere. A close-up, here are some kiosks. This is where you buy your, your Arizona croissant and the daily paper, and this Weed, Arizona, your rolling papers over here. Here is another center. Also, as I say, this is a city that was founded and constructed in its initial stages all at once. And I am a believer in the all at once, if only as a medium of propagandizing for a certain vision of the city. So here is another center in Weed, Arizona. Here, yet another. But this is an image that engages what I think will be one of the primary problems of urbanism in the future, which is, although uses are all going to be compatible, assuming that we reduce the effluent and people can keep it down after 11 o'clock, it's still going to be true that we will have in cities to deal with discrepancies in size. And I dare say that this is going to be a very interesting problem for all of us. It's the idea that some things simply will be larger than other things. If I had the next drawing, these would extend as long as this building. Longer still, 3/4 of a mile in this direction, and yet be somehow sympathetically integrated with things of other scales. A model showing some of the transportation. Here we're coming to the edge of the city, the tennis courts, on the cool waters of Lake Weed, the detail. And finally, I believe we are now leaving Weed, Arizona. And you can see these circulation routes, all of which are meant to bring people from within the neighborhoods down to the primary civic asset of Weed, Arizona, which is this beautiful lake that's created by the dam a few miles upstream on the lower Colorado River, not too far from Yuma, Arizona. A second city from scratch. I went to Japan for the first time some years ago, and a little later than these guys over here, but I nevertheless got there. And the first place that I visited in Japan, this may turn into a 3 Coca-Cola lecture. The first place that I visited in Japan was Osaka, a dreadful city. Sprawling, out of control, ugly, too big, stupid. But as I was having my first day, being driven around, the visiting firemen, seeing the sights, I came across something in Osaka that absolutely astonished me. And that was the site in the downtown between two huge concrete office buildings of a farm, which was producing very small quantities of some crop in the midst of downtown Osaka. And I thought, that is fabulous. Why can't we have that here? And of course, I know the reason, that the real estate regime will not permit it. And indeed, one would not expect the real estate regime in Japan to permit it, save for the fact that they have a very strong relationship to the idea of self-sufficiency in agriculture. I think a very useful concept, certainly in vetting the efficiency and generosity of cities. They revere agriculture. And they have an inheritance law that apparently allows farms that are kept in production to be passed on without the payment of any taxes. With that kind of strategy, if we valued the idea of farms in neighborhoods enough, we could create them. In the same way we use our legal structure to create other desirables that there's some social consensus about. So this inspired the design of the second city from scratch, which is called Neurasia. And this exists somewhere on a line that we drew between Hanoi and Hong Kong. And it is, in fact, a linear city of the most traditional late 19th century type. Here you can see a waterway, boats plying, transportation, some kind of mechanical circulation. And along this line, as I say, Hong Kong, Hanoi, cities sprout up wherever there is demand and bearing capacity for urbanization. So here is one city, here is another city. This is a logarithmic drawing, so you have to imagine this is 200 kilometers here between these two cities. So having launched on this speculation about a way of beginning to create this urban structure to deal with the tremendous pace of Asian urbanization, we looked a little more closely, made this drawing, and you can see this is very weed-like in terms of its assumptions. There are neighborhoods here; they look a little more villagey, because that was the notion. People are coming in from villages, so why not allow them to live in something a little more habituated? Again, this dense skein of circulatory possibilities, cars left at the periphery, and this rejiggered ratio between green and blue and built space. I think you can get the scale of this thing. This is even lower than weed. Judging by these shadows, they look to be 2-3 stories high. Again, it's a drawing that exceeds my ability to explain it. I don't, for example, much speculation at the CIA headquarters about these cylinders here in the middle of town. Secret nuclear experiments, petroleum supply, houses for people who like curved walls. I'm not sure. But they're different from these. Of that I am certain. And I also know that this is a major waterway in Neurasia. There they are again, perplexing in their indifference to analysis. Again, dense circulatory possibilities. Here is one of those villages or neighborhoods which seems to be a bit larger. I mean, this is something you have to do to your own work, is look at it as from the spy satellites circling the Earth and try to figure out what the hell it contains or engenders or suggests or demands. So this neighborhood being a little larger, we concluded that it might have some mercantile or administrative function, particularly when we saw this agora-like central space in the midst of it and this gateway-like arrangement here. But I couldn't tell you for absolute sure. Here's a squarish neighborhood. Here's a roundish neighborhood, very much smaller than the squarish neighborhood, and somehow based around this stop on the high-speed magnetic levitation rapid transit system. Delivers you to your car in 30 seconds flat, no fuss, no muss. I'm a friend of technology. Here's a striated neighborhood, and here we come to the edge of Neurasia. And here we really come to the edge of Neurasia as the built form lapses fairly quickly into the landscape of agricultural fields and then into what so many of us call nature. Now I show you a couple of projects of more recent vintage, equally utopian in spirit, both commissioned by magazines under the rubric, the blank, fill it in, of the future. This one, the retirement community of the future, dig it? So the first thought was, nobody in my generation is going to be able to retire. So it's a small, it's a village. It's a little town. Again, same principles. A series of centers in order to make neighborhoods cohere. Cars get left at the periphery. A lot of water, by way of thermal regulation, transportation, fishing, etc. And then took a slightly closer look at the unit type. One of the issues we confront is, with these 6 billion people on the planet, it probably is not possible for every domicile to be bespoke. We need to think about repetitive units. We need to think about mass housing. We need to think about types that are similar. So this is a row housing type, which turns out to be the predominant architectural character of the retirement community of the future. You see these party walls. But they're oriented south. Each of them has a greenhouse for solar heating and gardening. And each row of houses has one of these, John Todd living machines in order to turn the black water into gray water and recirculate it for the plumbing and the gardening. Again, no cars, but one does like to speculate about what the individually tailored mobility module of the future might be like. And in this town, they turned out to be these lovely, soft, slow-moving, hydrogen-powered bubble cars, which are either available for your personal use, they dock very nicely, or the robotic bubble car can be summoned over the internet. When you place your order on Amazon for Tom Main's latest monograph, some things just look better on that glossy paper. At exactly 11:14 the next day, the FedEx bubble pulls up and disgorges it, onto your kitchen table. So here is the end of the row. Here is the green machine. Here are the tunable aerogel bubble windows. And at the time we were thinking about this, we were fascinated to discover that there is a plastic available made out of soybeans. So these are soy plastic snap-together panels, which, totally sustainable building product, the added advantage that if the Social Security check should fail to arrive at the appropriate moment, you can eat the house. Next project was the house of the future. Another one of these utopian projects. And one of the things I can say about the house of the future is that it's not going to accommodate the family of the past. You know, it is one of the unspoken truths of American civilization that the nuclear family now makes up something like a third of residential units. So it is far from being the predominant residential social typology, and yet it continues to inform the paradigms for domesticity and the construction of houses. This is another kind of a house. It's a kind of a co-housing scheme in which a variety of social arrangements are accommodated, and a small tribe might live here in this series of double units. There's a little bit of specialization within this thing. This is the collective space where people might work together or cook meals together, whatever. This is a place for kids. Here is some agriculture. Fortunately, human flight has become safe, cheap, and convenient, so it's easy to socialize with your neighbors in the next co-housing pod down the river. And as I say, it's made up of these series of double houses, each with its living machine in order to deal with the waste product. But you know, different strokes for different folks going on. You know, here is Lars and the biophysicist, and Ingrid, the material archaeologist, and there's Beth, the equestrienne in her hot tub. Here the living machine, here this double house, here the raft for the getaway, and here some drawings, I guess is the word, of what this house of the future might look like. Again, these winning bubble windows that automatically open and shut to accommodate will-o'-the-wisps and summer breezes and the passage of birds. Now, on a slightly more serious note, I mean, this is a project in Jerusalem, which is you know, some kind of degenerate utopia. You know, having been utopianized by all of the major religions of the world, or the three that on this half of the planet. You know, it is fatigued with the assumptions that have been imposed upon it. And this is a project, you know, for the development of Jerusalem that arose out of a conference that I was involved in organizing 3.5 years ago, the premise of which was Palestinian architects, Israeli architects, you know, other architects, we get together, we love the city, we can figure it out. You know? Somehow, the notion being that there are things that urbanists know that transcend the political. Now, of course, this is a complete fiction. But it turned out to be a fairly useful one in the context of this conference, and it was a conference in which I asked everyone to make an address to Jerusalem through the medium of a plan for the city. So the plan that we produced for the city was for the capital of Palestine. You know, everybody seemed to know in those days what the deal was going to be, but there had been no physical proposition for where the infrastructure for the Palestinian state might be. Here is the old city of Jerusalem. I'll go through this quickly. For those of you who don't know the city, there is a ridge which basically defines everything, with Ramallah up here and Bethlehem down here. On this side, on the western side, a Mediterranean ecology which comes sweeping in from the coast, gets to the top of the ridge, and then the desert ecology begins. Here is a kind of slope analysis. And here an aerial photograph in which you can see the old city of Jerusalem, which in fact is just 5% of the total area of the city. This kind of derelict river valley, the Kidron River Valley, the Mount of Olives, Israeli Jerusalem to the west, Palestinian Jerusalem to the east, Mount Scopus, and here a place called Wadi Jaws, which is what we selected as the site for our project. Wadi Jaws is where you go in Jerusalem if you need an obscure hubcap or cheap repairs to your Peugeot. It's very funky, very derelict, and very tractable in the sense of a potential building site. So we made 3 drawings. The first of which shows the larger context. Here you can see the Mediterranean side and the desert side. This is Ramallah. This is Bethlehem. Here, the old city. And what this drawing is meant to suggest is that this is a city that does not need to grow any further. You know, there's a particular invidious form of political sprawl in Jerusalem, but its consequences in the environment are every bit as deleterious as the local real estate variety. So this is a drawing meant to suggest there's plenty of potential density available within the boundaries of the existing city. And the pink stuff, the darker stuff, is meant to suggest places where the city could be thickened in place rather than spreading further over these fragile ecologies. At the next scale, the old city of Jerusalem, the existing East Jerusalem or Palestinian Central Business District is here, and this peanut is the administrative zone that we proposed in this place called Wadi Jaws, with embassies and ministries down here, and a new east-west boulevard, the Champs-Élysées of Palestine, Yasser Arafat Boulevard, running east-west, a direction in which the city is poorly connected for various obvious reasons. And here the Palestinian parliament facing across this beautiful desert landscape. And finally, at the most detailed drawing we made, again, here's the edge of the old city, this Kidron River Valley, which is renaturalized to become one of the central parks of Jerusalem, a kind of bridge between east and west. The series of ministries at the end of the peanut with the embassies and university here. The east-west boulevard, an edging boulevard in order to keep development to the east of this river valley, and the Olmstedian parks, the green necklace, in order to give focus and character to a series of existing Palestinian neighborhoods which could be expected to grow exponentially. I show one other Middle Eastern project just as a kind of equal time provision, which is an old competition project for Beirut. Some of you may have done this. And I show this because, you know, that same term of art that is used in Jerusalem, the green line, which has an evil meaning in the context of these divided cities. It means the line of demarcation between opposing sides. The green line in Jerusalem, which was a north-south line between the Jews and the Arabs. The green line in Beirut being the line of demarcation between the Christians and the Muslims during the period of the Civil War. So there was a competition not so many years ago for the, actually it was so many years ago, for the souks, for the central markets in Beirut. And we took this idea of the green line and wanted to make this an incident on a new kind of green line, and there will be more green lines anon, which was a line that somehow was a suture and not a barrier, something to join halves of the city divided rather than to impose an unbridgeable difference and division. So here it is as it works its way through the area of the competition. Again, a lot of cultural signals being given off on this site. So all the kind of historic vectors of scale are kept. Any existing architecture that survived the warfare remains. But somehow this market winds its way through this complex of buildings with a series of pavilions under which the fruit and veg gets sold to people who've come in from the neighborhoods to shop. It is deeply mixed in use. And the tops of these pavilions, of which more later are green space, are gardens, which are, in fact, the green space and gardening areas for apartments that are on the upper levels of the buildings. A little clearer in the section. Here you can see these mushroom-like market pavilions, the 4 layers of car bomb parking. And here is a better look at this kind of vertical differentiation into uses. So the parking, you know, the roll-up doors of the shops. Here on the second level are professional offices or the upper level of the shops. In the upper floors, the apartments which bridge across to these mushroom-like market pavilions, under which, you know, these counters appear. And here you can see, Fatima and Muhammad haggling over the price of aubergine. And the trees growing on the tops of the mushroom-like garden pavilions, I don't know if we can see, here's a bridge to one of the apartments across the way. And the last of the utopians, the utopian projects I want to show is a campus planning project. You know, this is something we do brilliantly in the United States. I mean, this is one of our great native acts of urbanization, a kind of set of intentional communities in the form of college campuses that are absolutely brilliant. I mean, they are pedestrian environments, they are of a very tractable and human scale, they are strong conducers of community, they are exemplary in their mutuality of ambition, they are models of governance, they are meritocracies, they have a lot to teach us as urbanists. And this is a scheme for the expansion and renewal of a university campus in Chicago, the University of Chicago. The historic portion of the campus is here. Here are two Olmsted parks, and this is the famous Midway from the '93 World's Fair. Yeah, here's the campus, and here is the Dresden-like state of the Woodlawn neighborhood to the south, with which the university has had historic conflicts. So the first thing we began to think about was, you know, in order to figure out this, we really needed to think about this. So this is a plan that we proposed for the university and its neighborhood. So the big move at this scale, here you can see those two Olmstedian parks, was in fact to revert to some original intentions of the designer. Now, these are very fraught, and when one gets into the John Ashcroft territory here, you know, when you're making arguments from the original intentions of the framers, but sometimes the original intentions are good ones, as per Olmsted's idea that there be some kind of watercourse to connect these two parks. So this is not exactly the one that Frederick designed. It's a little more sinewy, but the idea that making this barrier would somehow make the two halves of the university campus more proximate, more accessible, seemed logical to us. The notion that there would be the pleasure of crossing a bridge, that there would be this lovely south-facing bank for sunning in the summertime, the idea that the seriality of the bridges and the places in between would begin to suggest a kind of rhythm, and that would allow this portion of the South Campus to be rejuvenated and cease its one directionality. You know, it has its front to the Midway and turns its back to the neighborhood. So we thought the university, you know, like the good city, should have a very clearly demarcated edge to the neighborhood with appropriate shops and community activities, and that the stewardship of the green spaces in the neighborhood was a logical way for the university to participate in revitalization without oppressing people. So here are some of the green spaces we propose that the university take care of. Here is the historic Henry Ives Cobb Gothic Revival set of quadrangles, quite beautiful. And here is the so-called North Campus. Eero Saarinen did a master plan for this campus in the early 60s that had a series of extremely stupid propositions in it. One of them was to tear down the football stadium and make this enormous Walter Netsch library. I don't know that Walter Netsch was his intention. The problem being that it sits squarely athwart the main north-south movement axis of the campus. So it stops movement short and obliges people to circulate around it. So our proposal to the university, I think you can more or less read what's new and what's old in this drawing. One of our major proposals to them was that they bash through this library in order to create a continuous circulation axis, which then gets doubled with a kind of slower speed, more meandering axis to the side. This was the point at which the university administrators advised us to lay down our pencils and return home. But we refused. So carried on to finish up this project, and I show you a few of the drawings we make. So here is this North Campus. Here is the bashing through the library, the pink Walter Netsch library, and here is a kind of crosswise axis to join these scientific buildings And this gymnasium and this gymnasium, this is an old gymnasium, this is the new natatorium. So the idea, the image in mind was somebody coming, dripping wet from the new pool to the great library to sit in a comfortable chair and read the Phaedrus, you know? What a vision. Here are some plans, you know, there were theaters, all kinds of goodies. And this was the image we showed them in order to suggest the character of what might happen if they were to bash through the limestone Walter Netsch library with some kind of Kyrene passageway. Creating within the library, which is at present meanly dimensioned and oppressive, a lofty Gothic-style reading room. But never mind. And this is just a quick 360-degree tour of some sketches of that North Campus. Here, the new natatorium, the old field house, the old gym, the library, the new dormitories, the theatrical complex. Here, the back door of the library with this new passageway flowing through it and this sinewy connector joining two halves of the campus. And here, the front door with a lovely new dormitory and swimming pool and so on. And here, the main street of the existing neighborhood of Woodlawn, 63rd Street, brought back to life through the tender ministrations of the university. Which brings us to the second half of the lecture. New York City, for which I open this Coca-Cola and pick up the pace. But I realize I haven't given a lecture at SCI-Arc since 1991, so I'm going to take my fucking time. We're in Queens. Queens now, in Far Rockaway, the fabled Far Rockaway. Those of you from New York know that one of our well-kept secrets is that we have beautiful beaches far superior to your own, which face south across the vast gray roiling Atlantic. And here is one in Far Rockaway. This is a project for an urban renewal site, an existing urban renewal site in Far Rockaway, Queens, and there are 2,500 housing units. Again, engaging this problem of the kind of odd seriatim housing type, but wiggled, you know, with some set of variations. So the big moves here, I mean, you know, the genius of New York City, of course, is that we have public transportation. So you can take the A train to there. You can go on the subway, get out, and walk to the beach. I mean, this is genius. So the main move here is to bring the beach to the subway and vice versa, which organizes the entire project. A series of commercial and higher density activities around this periphery. Access to the subway and to a high-speed set of ferries which can go around here and then zip to Brooklyn and Manhattan, or around here and to go to Kennedy Airport in 3 minutes. And then within this set of housing types. Now, yeah, you know, just to back up a bit, I mean, it is a waterfront place. And I think that there are two basic typological approaches to designing places at the beach. One of them is the Santa Monica paradigm, which is kind of low-rise, high-density. People have access to the beach through smell, through acoustics, through beach culture, but not necessarily through a direct view of the ocean. The other paradigm is the Rio de Janeiro or Chicago or Riverside Drive paradigm, which essentially suggests a row of high-rise buildings, preferably single-loaded, in which every room has a view of the ocean. So this is off the site, but we sort of, you know, it's always important to keep sketching beyond the site. So we just made this sketch to show what the other paradigm might work out looking like, creating this big beach/park event, everybody with a view. But for us, we decided to go with the Santa Monicoid paradigm, and here it be. Each of these is a 12-unit co-bungalow. Here again, you can see this beach subway connection, the commercial spaces. This back to front, these are existing middle-income housing slabs. Here you can see the convenient intermodal connection between subway and ferry and neighborhood. Here is the superstructure of the elevated subway, We've cleared the roadway out from underneath to make a kind of slow motion transitway. Here are people on bikes. Those bubble cars will be there soon. And here you can see this kind of curving space with commercial activity and professional offices and apartments. Kennedy is near. Here again, looking from the beach along this commercial strip, which fronts on this, and here the boardwalk along the beach. That's an existing condition. Here the subway. And here the architectural type. Again, these 12-unit co-bungalows. Each bungalow has a greenhouse facing south, which is solar heating, gardening, social space. They're all wiggled a little bit in order to try to get each apartment to have at least a partial view down these very broad streets where all the parking takes place of the ocean. And here a plasticine model with its greenhouse, stiff breeze off the ocean for some micro turbines. And these things, like the Gothic architecture of that university campus, join up, connect, make a labyrinth, create a kind of internal condition for the circulation of pedestrians within the site. Here is a view looking away from the beach. These greenhouses are facing south, I learned that much, with the wind turbines. And here a view looking towards the beach when the runoff is coming this way, so we capture it here. The turbine, and here you can see that somewhat labyrinthine interior space that belongs to the 8 or 10 co-bungalows that occupy one of these superblock conditions. Moving briskly along, we cross into Brooklyn, and we're in a neighborhood called East New York. The Rockaways are about here. Kennedy Airport is over here, so it's not far away. And this is a somewhat older project. East New York is a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn, way out there, which is rich in three resources. It has a very activated community, and a community that had a great interest in urban agriculture. In fact, there were societies among these poor people where they were growing vegetables and giving them away to homeless people. A second resource is a lot of vacant land, most of it in the ownership of the city of New York, buildings that fell into tax arrears, confiscated, torn down. You can see this lacing of vacant lots. And then it has a museological resource, which is to say, it is the museum of every failed social housing typology since the dawn of consciousness. Amazing variety of lousy housing. So the notion was what to do, how to transform this neighborhood, which had no pattern, which had too much empty space, too many streets, too few buildings, too little greenery, too little activity, how to convert it into something better. The details of which we were uncertain about at the moment we began to draw. So, next reel. We're going through these cokes very fast. Ready? Yeah. So we began to draw. It's another one of those drawings. Again, I am an apostle. I preach to you students. You must always draw in a somewhat vague way in order to suggest, at the moment you are vague, this is not the time to pencil certainties. You can pencil vagaries, which then can accrete certainties as you learn more and more. So here are a series of vagaries, which are essentially depicting the way in which these new energies are entering the community, green energies and constructed energies and blue energies. And what they're doing is they're Marcel Marceauing their way through these vacant spaces, looking for somewhere to alight in this neighborhood in order to begin the operation of transformation. And finally, we produced this drawing, which is vague, as I said. And vagueness has its uses, but one of its best uses is not a presentation to a community board. So at this point, we began to another direction of speculation, and that was since we only had vague ideas, we wondered what the nature of an absolutely minimal intervention in this environment might be in order to leverage a transformation, the details of which were uncertain. And what we concluded was, plant a tree in an intersection. And we anticipated a number of consequences resulting from this, and made this drawing, which was, we thought, a little more presentable for the community types, you know, including, as it does, acres of zipatone. So anyway, the implications of this act of acupuncturing East New York. Here you can see the acupuncture points. Traffic is immediately calmed in the lee of these acupuncture points. So this green space represents a kind of calming and exclusion of the cars and the possibility for this agrarian activity that people seem to be interested in. So around this space, a relatively lower density kind of habitation happens, and this was also something that was much in demand. Single houses, row houses, granny flats, the whole apparatus. But we anticipated that there might be a further consequence to what we had done. And that was that by creating these lower density residential neighborhoods, we thought we might force the issue and create some higher density centers of a dead traditional street-oriented type, and of a sort that did not exist in East New York because there are too many streets. As I said, the commerce is attenuated by this excess of roadway. So you shop here, you schlep another 5 blocks to the next one. And somehow we thought that paradoxically, by lowering the density in these places, we could selectively raise the density and generate street-based commercial activity. And then we decided, let us think about a kind of housing typology, again, a loft housing typology that might fit into the context of a kind of fragmented neighborhood without a uniform architectural character, but with a lot of vacant lots. We didn't want to displace anybody from our home, so this is a kind of complex of buildings, and again, you'll see why I showed you that Beirut stuff, that weaves its way through these found vacant lots and forms a kind of complex in the middle of the block. So here you can see this pedestrian way making its way through the middle of the block. Here the common space belonging to each of these shrooms, as we call them. And here these cores which support the loft units which occur on the upper floors. They cantilever out from the cores. You know, there's lots of stairs in this building. Here's that central green room. We called it, again, a social and agriculture and environmental space. Here I think you can see those pads or pods projecting out. So you go from a kind of most public environment to a semi-public environment to a most private environment at the periphery of the building. And then when you get to the roof, it becomes public again. And it's maybe slightly overwrought. But the notion is that each of these buildings would be linked to its neighbors and so on and so on and so on to form this green terrain which was flowing through the neighborhood and maybe glomming onto other roofs around it. Here's a section in which you can see that common space shared by all the units, an elevation showing how succinctly and unaggressively it nestles among the existing buildings of any neighborhood. And somewhat Jetsons-like. There's quite an interesting moment at the end of this long cantilever, speculating about whether these guys would bounce. Clearly, they would bounce. Brooklyn, still, we're heading quickly in. We're in the home stretch now. I'm going to show you 3 projects, and we're out of here. One is here, one is here, and one is here. You all recognize, you're all oriented. This is the Brooklyn Bridge. This is the bottom of Manhattan. This is Battery Park City, and here is the site of the Trade Center. That's a tunnel. That's something called Governor's Island, of which more anon. Here is a set of piers below beautiful Brooklyn Heights. They have been derelict for years, you know, victim of the typical pattern. Freight is containerized, it moves to New Jersey where there are wide open spaces. Nobody takes an ocean liner anymore. Who needs all these piers? So they are now going to build a park there. And fair enough. But we made an unsolicited master plan for this park, reacting against the fact that New York is very much consumed with issues of its waterfront. We have something like 600 miles of waterfront within the city of New York. The problem is that anytime anybody suggests something for these areas of waterfront, it's one of two things. Either it's an Olmstedian park or it's Battery Park City. Well, nothing exactly meretricious about either of these possibilities, but it somehow did not seem to exhaust the repertoire of possibilities for building on the New York City waterfront. So we tried to imagine, here it is, there's Governor's Island, an old photograph. We tried to imagine another kind of a park, a radically mixed-use park that treated the waterfront in a different way. I think that the typical way of conceptualizing a waterfront is an edge, a barrier, the seam between land and water. In fact, the waterfront is a gradient, the more so here, which starts with the heights in Brooklyn, drops down to an area of fill, although still terra firma, but also embraces structures on piles, wetlands, things that are tethered and floating, things that are floating free, a very amphibious condition rather than this kind of radical disjuncture between land and water. No, the waterfront extends deep into the city, and the city extends deep out into the water. And we wanted to do a kind of park scheme that made the most of the idea of this kind of gradient. So here it is. There's some continuous circulation, yada yada, going all along the waterfront. There are these series of island-like things. The piers, as you can see, are dissolving. We have this deconsecrated cruise ship to serve as a conference center. That was something in the original brief. And down here we have an industrial use, which is in fact barge building and fitting out. And the idea of this park was that it's made of these barges. They get fitted out as little parks or daycare centers or clam bars or clinics or shuffleboard courts, whatever, floated upstream, and they kind of nudge their way to shore and get caught there, get trapped by other barges and get lashed together and bridges form and they become more or less permanent. Although with some effort they can be demounted, recirculated, sent back to the shop and refitted as something else. So here you can see the islands, the circulation way, the ocean liner, the dissolving of the piers and the arrival of the barges. Here's a slightly more detailed study of a place. And here you can see more precisely the way in which these floating structures drift in and become trapped by the means of circulating between them. Here is an amphitheater on an artificial island facing the fabulous view of Manhattan. And here one of the pre-existing piers, which is in the process of dissolving into a series of loft-like spaces. Again, as per all of these projects, circulation is complex. I am a strong believer that one of the things that makes cities great is the possibility of getting lost. And the possibility of getting lost exists both in the sense that one literally loses one's way, but also in the structure of accidental encounter that arises in a city where not everything is predictable. Again, central to both urban pleasure and urban democracy. You can't see that, so let's move along. Here's the cruise ship is now morphed into an aircraft carrier, the better to demilitarize and play shuffleboard on the deck. And here is the Brooklyn Souk, a series of market buildings that have arisen in this kind of protective leeward space suggested by this aircraft carrier, and there the Brooklyn Bridge. Here you can see one of the piers prior to the construction of the park, and here you can see it as the park gets underway. We're out in the middle of the harbor now, rapidly heading west. This Governor's Island, it's just been remanded to the custody of my university, the City University of New York. And this was some speculation about a campus plan for a University of the Earth on Governor's Island for all the environmental and earth sciences faculties from around the university. This is an historic fortress left over from the War of 1812. The British never came. It was never put to use. Here it was a Coast Guard station for many years, and this is the sergeant and the colonel and the general, in the carefully hierarchical arrangement. Nice brick houses. So all that historic stuff got kept. Here is a bit of a speculation about beginning to build these structures on the island that were reminiscent of this beautiful brick fortress. And here, the first great insight, which was in order to use those outdoor spaces all the year round, we thought we might figure out a way for these condom-like membranes to inflate in the inclement weather, protecting the interior quadrangles of the, here's a slightly more rational version of these membrane domes on these loft-like campus buildings. Here is the central place, and an identical drawing, and finally the presentable drawing in which we have correctly colored circulation in mustard and historical buildings in brown and new construction in red. You can see that this island is pivotal in waterborne circulation in New York, so we wanted to exploit that greatly as a kind of transit stop coming from everywhere. People coming from Far Rockaway would be disgorged here, go to Plaza there, head into Manhattan on that ferry, et cetera, et cetera. But as I suggested to you, you must always go a little too far when doing these projects, particularly when nobody's paying you. So our way of going too far was imagining that those membranes somehow could embody a principle of continuous growth, something that the biologists could impart, some kind of DNA, something we could grow from seeds, and they would just attenuate and somehow grow these shells which could be occupied. And the fantasy got thicker and thicker, and here you can see them growing higher and higher and getting more and more heliotropic and inflecting with great delicacy in the direction of the sun as it sets low over the horizon of New Jersey in the western distance. Poignant to date one's work before and after the Trade Center, but a kind of homage to those great buildings. And finally, well, not exactly finally, penultimately, another waterfront project. Here, in fact, is the Trade Center. Here is Battery Park City, and this is the west side of Manhattan. And I have to tell a small anecdote about this. The origins of this project. There used to be an elevated highway, rather beautiful elevated highway, that ran along the western edge of Manhattan that was built in the 1920s. And I can remember one of the few moments of bonding with my dad in my childhood came when he would drive us down the West Side Highway to visit his mother in Brooklyn. And we'd come down the West Side Highway, and I would sit obviously on the passenger side, and would be intoxicated by the rhythm that was visible from above of pier and ship and pier and ship and pier and ship and pier and ship, and loved this journey to Brooklyn via a series of these elevated highways of similar vintage. Well, one day in the 70s, a truck driver was making his way north on the elevated highway when, to his chagrin, the truck fell through to the roadway below. And it seems that the highway was rusted to oblivion, was closed immediately, and demolished. The question arose, what shall we do to replace this roadway? And the initial suggestion was for something called Westway. Westway was a proposal to fill in the Hudson River from the bulkhead to the pierhead, 800 feet, from Lower Manhattan all the way to 59th Street, creating doing what we do best in New York, creating a vast reservoir of commercial real estate possibilities, and a park. Now, the reason that this was such a compelling idea was that it was going to be leveraged by the construction of a 10-lane interstate highway underneath. Why were cities doing things like this? Well, the answer was fairly straightforward. Those were the days in which highway money was available to municipalities at 90%. So city after city, including this one, fell over themselves to get this federal dough, and committed suicide in the project. This was opposed by many citizens, both on the basis that it was not a mass transit solution in a mass transit-oriented city. But what finally struck the death knell of this possibility, which was going to be the most expensive piece of highway construction in the history of consciousness, a billion a mile, I think, in 1970 dollars. What finally sank it, as it were, was a lawsuit filed by the redoubtable Marcy Bienenstock on behalf of the striped bass population of the Hudson River, who, it seems, delighted in fornicating among the pilings beneath the piers on the Hudson River. The lawsuit was successful, and the highway was stopped, but the most memorable comment made by any public official in the course of these deliberations was spoken by our beloved ex-mayor, Ed Koch, who was a strong advocate of the Westway project, who said at the end in desperation, "If those striped bass need a place to fuck, I will build them a motel in Peekskill." A dreary town up north on the Hudson. Well, and end of that story. But they have just now completed, what else? A highway on this site. They call it a boulevard, and the neighbors were allowed to pick out the historic ornamental street lamps that illuminate the accident zone. But a dreary prospect with a miserable little park along the edge here and astroturf on some of these existing piers. Well, it seemed to us like an unsolicited master plan was called for. So first of all, transportation, please. A series of intermodal incidents along the waterfront where a light rail system could transfer to a waterborne system. That's the scrupulous part. And here was the plan. This is 14th Street. This is Battery Park City. Here is this weed-like transitway that's created by snipping off the ends of the existing piers, building slightly arched bridges in order to permit the Bateau-Mouche-style water taxis and buses to pass under them at high tide, a kind of recarving of this is a big existing pier, and the addition of some new piers. This is a waterfront that has been dynamic for years, and the scrupulosity of certain neighborhood groups about nothing new seemed dubious, given the fact that there have been various patterns of pier construction since the 17th century along this edge, and that the currently reverenced piers date from the early 20th century, which doesn't seem to give them any special authority. However, I said waterfronts are amphibious, so for the sake of argument, we insisted that this waterfront extend at least in its influence to 6th Avenue, deep in the city, and that we pull this kind of energy of park making and greening. We kept the alignment of the boulevard that they've built. That this energy seep into the city in the form of what we call green fill, which was in this case the suggestion that one lane of every street in Greenwich Village basically be removed from the traffic system and given over to the pedestrian system, whether as street trees or bicycle storage or as a way of dealing with the idiotic way we dispose of waste in New York, which is to say, put it in a hefty bag and leave it on the curb. So a series of greenfield. The red stuff is new construction on the relatively small number of vacant and soft sites in the neighborhood. In slightly closer detail, this is a farmer's market, a series of new parks. Here we carve through the so-called Gansevoort Peninsula, which is actually not filled. It's one of the only pre-existing pieces of land down here, which is filled to about there. You saw the fresh piers. This is Pier 40, which gets carved up for a series of reuses. This is Christopher Street, which comes to this bathhouse and beer garden. The transitway, Jane Jacobs Park. Here is the great Piazza San Giuliani, facing westward across the Hudson for sunsets, again over New Jersey. And here we carve right through miserable Battery Park City in order to correct a hydrological defect in the geometry of the fill, which in its current incarnation creates a dead zone here, and in order to attenuate our transit route through Battery Park City. Here are some drawings, some mild-mannered before and after drawings of the Piazza San Giuliani. You're looking north. Here's Pier 40, which is morphed into the Villa Savoy, again, for inexplicable reasons. Here is the interior of the Piazza San Giuliani facing the river, and here is an enormous existing loft building that gets recontoured into more useful spaces. There's the Trade Center. Here's a bit of Pier 40, and here's a bit of a taste of what the edge is like. Again, here's that pier, and this was from an earlier incarnation where we were putting some islands. There's one of those arched bridges with the water bus gliding gracefully, clearing by a mere 2 inches below the bridge. And here, a kind of intermodal there. Bus, walkway, boat, transfer. You get the drill. And a few other images of the project, Battery Park City and its playing fields. This is my studio. Welcome. We're on the 8th floor. I'm not sure for how long. And here is a big piece of the highway circulatory system of New York that has been removed from the realm of the car. And after we appropriate one tube of the Holland Tunnel for light rail, it also becomes an intermodal mass transit and play space. And finally, a kind of School of Hugh Ferris zoning envelope study of a series of soft sites around, again, my office, around that same area. Okay, I'm going to show one more project. And people always say to me, why are you still showing paper slides? Because well, yes, a very reasonable question. So the kids in my office loaded up this PowerPoint presentation. And this is my first PowerPoint presentation. And let us see whether I can do this. Bear with me. Let's take this. Double click. It comes, your slideshow. Click. Shit. Now what do I do? Okay, there we are. Start with one. Slide. Yes. All right. I know I have a bit of a somber demeanor here. Everybody in New York is working on the Trade Center site. I imagine many of you have worked on it as well. I've been doing scheme after scheme for it, as have my students, over the last year or so. You may have read something about the process that we're currently going through in the city in order to try to decide what to do. The process is profoundly corrupt and undemocratic. What it calls for is protest in whatever register you sing songs of protest most comfortably. Mine have been journalistic and architectural. Starting with this first project, which was simply a project in the immediate aftermath about securing the site with an earth berm. I felt very strongly then that it could not be decided what to do. I'm not yet entirely persuaded that we are sufficiently wise or knowledgeable, but the press of events is so fast nowadays that you will see we have decided to do some schemes. So the first one was that earth berm. And the insight that followed on securing this space and sort of holding it harmless, as it were, for a period of time, was that it could then become a point of dissemination for something that took place in a much wider context. It became clear from the get-go that the problems created by the terrorists attacking the World Trade Center were not going to be redressed on that 14-acre site, but which required a vision that looked beyond to the texture of Lower Manhattan, to the needs of the Manhattan and New York City as a whole. So this is beginning to suggest that that site, in its secured but unbuilt context, could become a point of dissemination for the pedestrianization and the greening of Lower Manhattan. And here you can see these tendrils are beginning to spread from this area. The second thought, the second kind of big thought about how to approach the site was a thought about disaggregation. The idea that there was no particular reason to build 12 million square feet of office space there, in a city in which there were a series of centers in the outer boroughs and elsewhere in Manhattan that could absorb that kind of space, that could also absorb sufficient housing for the people who worked there, that had existing transit connections, and that had neighborhoods around them with people who were eager for jobs, who could walk to work, and neighborhoods which could really use the infusion of energy and capital that disaggregating, the replacement of that lost space might provide. So this is just a drawing showing some places around New York where this construction might take place, including Queens Plaza and Jamaica and Flushing and Yankee Stadium and the Bronx Hub and Staten Island and so on. Another way of approaching this idea of replacement via disaggregation was simply to look around Lower Manhattan for sites that could be built upon. And this is the wrong image. The right image has more red spots on it. But what it demonstrates is that if there were a will, there is certainly plenty of space. I think in this drawing we calculated that if each of those spots had a 25-story building, the lost space could be replaced off-site with ease. Then, the thinking continued into a series of studies about how to design, everything in Lower Manhattan except the space of the Trade Center. And this is a, 8 months ago version of that plan. I don't have the latest. But here you can see the space is still unoccupied, ground zero. But the red spots have taken up the slack in construction, and this pedestrian network has begun to spread. Indeed, one of the Westway features is revived here, which is the burial of this highway from here all the way to there, including access to the tunnel here, which enables a big kind of swath of park space to enter the city and to create one of those valuable New York City edge incentives that the city does so well. But of course, one is also dealing with this. It does seem that there is a strong constituency, and I dare say it's my impression that there is a majority constituency that wants to see something built on the site. Even the survivors seem to feel that some restoration, some healing of the skyline is appropriate. As I say, I'm still a little ambivalent about this, but one thing that I know I don't want to see on that skyline, which is, I would say, the major portion of proposals that have been vetted or circulated are so far, are any more goddamn phallomorphic skyscraper thingies. So the first thought was, what is something else that could be legible and imageable that might be erected on that site to do this repair work, but which would not be a skyscraper, certainly not a commercial skyscraper. So we began to think about this dome, and it grew out of these studies. One of the mystifications that's being handed to us is that the most functionally sensitive act of remediation on this site is the restoration of the so-called historic street grid. That all these surrounding streets will be reconstructed. Although there are some arguments from nostalgia for this piece of the grid, which exists on land that is historically fill, its primary impetus seems to be to carve up the site into developable, which is to say real estate parcels. This seems premature, and it does seem to me that the sound arguments for the restoration of the grid downtown, which are the World Trade Center, monolithic construction, could not cross the site, terrible, that is a legitimate issue, but the restoration of the grid is only one of many ways of providing the possibility for people on foot to cross the site. One of them, of course, is simply securing the site as a big pedestrian space. I've just been to Isfahan, which has a central square, which is only a few stories high, which is about this size. So for those of you who've been there, the space is strong and imageable and it's okay as an open space. It would work. It could be viable. Another way, you know, the other thing that has happened is that the auratic power of the footprints seems to have been relatively firmly established. Nobody knows what the memorial will be, but the territory of sacrality seems, in common imagination, certainly to embrace something called the footprints. Of course, they are fictitious because they no longer have any recognizable existence on the site. In order to have these footprints, we would have to reconstruct them. And, you know, an interesting debate that isn't exactly happening has to do with the radius of the aura of these footprints. And, you know, there was a news story a month or two ago that sort of went under everybody's radar, in which the Port Authority, who owned the site, made an auratic decision in which they concluded that they would not locate any commercial space under the footprints, but thought it was okay for the commuter railroad to go under the footprints. This is a very, very precise decision on the part of the Port Authority about the sacrality of this place and how you parse it that nobody has attended to. And this is a discussion that we really haven't had. Unfortunately, what's going to happen in the process is they're going to figure out a project which will designate a place as sacred, and then they will have a competition which we will all foolishly enter. So here are some images of this dome. You know, the World Peace Dome, whatever, call it what you like, with a series of crescent-shaped structures within it. You know, the fantasy was it's the UN or it's the kind of headquarters of NGOs or something benign, you know, some institutions. I mean, I do come increasingly to think that, I mean, never mind the cemetery on the outskirts of Genoa, that the restoration of some forms of human activity, particularly forms of activity that provide the intersection of bodies and space, is important, I think, to restoring life on the site. So here you can see the streets this is the West Street, which becomes a green space. And here you can see this is at the end of, this is Greenwich Street, which everybody wants to reconnect. So it reconnects through the dome, and you can see a bit of these buildings. I think it's about 60 stories. This is the building that's already under construction on the edge of the site in Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. You know, a dome. And then the dome went away, and these finger-like things, this is kind of last week's state of the project, with these drawings, with this kind of Fata Morgana existing in the sky, some ghost. Again, these are better than the computer drawings because they are imprecise in the way that the current thinking in the studio is imprecise. These are a couple of weeks old. And this begins to suggest an attitude towards a site in which the footprints remain the focus of reverence, define an auratic space around them, but are somehow embraced by the fingers of this encompassing and peaceable hand. And I think that will be enough for one evening. Thank you. Questions? So, application deadline for the Master in Urban Planning at City College, January 1st.